Her life is shrouded in secrets and legends. Contemporaries respected and feared her, and historians still argue about the details of her biography. What was Cleopatra, Queen of Kings, really like? Why is she considered one of the greatest women in history? And what fatal mistake had cost her the life of her lover and her own? This is a Biographer History channel, and we continue to talk about the life of this legendary woman. Click on the subscribe button and the bell, and we are going to the 30 BC. Cleopatra received news from Antony all winter. At that time, the Parthians had already passed through Phoenicia, Judea, and Syria, and at the end of the year captured Jerusalem. Herod, one of the rulers of Judea and the future king, barely managed to escape. He began to seek refuge in neighboring countries in vain, but he was sheltered in Alexandria. Cleopatra knew him as Antony's faithful friend and a loyal ally of Rome, but she had other motives for not refusing to help him. Herod supported her father and then herself in a difficult moment. Parthians were their common enemies. Cleopatra hoped that the Jewish ruler would join her Ethiopian campaign, or Antony, who was going to the Parthians. The queen immediately offered Herod to lead the army, but he refused to accept the command. Cleopatra then lent him a galley so that he could make the risky winter journey to Rome. Perhaps when sending Herod to Rome, Cleopatra asked him to whisper important news to Antony. At the end of the year, she had twins. The father did not see the children. He had just married Octavia, but their mother and her divine ancestors were quite enough for them. This time, the queen did not call the children by their father's name. She did better. The boy was named Alexander Julius, in honor of the sun and the greatest warrior of all time, who pacified the Parthians themselves, and the girl was named Cleopatra Selene, in honor of the moon and in memory of her great-grandmother and outstanding Ptolemaic ruler. From year 40 to 37, Cleopatra's life resembled a Greek drama. Bloodshed took place behind the scenes, and the queen learned about them from third parties. In the spring of the 38th year, Octavia gave birth to her first child. Instead of the long-awaited boy, it was a girl. Meanwhile, the Parthians advanced westward, deftly taking advantage of the Roman troubles. Cleopatra became nervous when the conquerors were near her borders. The Parthians were very determined because their ancestors once owned Egypt. Antony ordered one of his commanders to deal with the rebels, and he did a great job with it. The famine continued, and disturbance was brewing again in Rome. Once, when Octavian appeared in the forum, he was immediately surrounded by a mob of angry citizens who accused the recent idol of looting the treasury. In response to his excuse, stones flew at the ruler. The beating did not stop even when the bloodied victim fell on the cobblestones. Mark Antony, who very appropriately appeared, fought off the barely alive Octavian from the mad crowd and took him to his home, to the same villa where they first met under completely different circumstances. By the way, Fulvia warned her husband about Octavian for good reason. He turned out to be not such a faithful ally as Cleopatra, and although friendly relations were established between them, Antony increasingly found himself in the shadow of his relative. After some time, Octavian's successes began to annoy him. Cleopatra sent a famous prophet to Antony. Antony shared his worries with him and asked him to make a horoscope for him. We'll never know whether the astrologer actually consulted the stars or was merely doing his queen's bidding, but he said that Antony's star would have shone much brighter had it not been overshadowed by Octavian's star. The astrologer advised the Roman to stay as far away from his friend as possible, and the invitation to Alexandria came very appropriately. Antony set out, but when he reached Athens, he decided to spend the winter there and stayed for 2 whole years. At banquets and philosophical debates, he appeared together with his closest friends or Octavia, with whom he was apparently quite happy. Antony again changed the purple toga to Greek clothing and began to be called Dionysus, and he allowed his wife, who had just given birth to his second daughter, to be called Athena. The game of gods ceased to bring former pleasure as soon as Octavian decided to join it. He arranged a masquerade and was dressed as Apollo. Antony was still surprised by him. In his 38th year, Octavian, who had earned a reputation as a virtuous boor, left his wife, who had just given birth, to marry a woman named Livia, who was 6 months pregnant by her former husband. The marriage allowed him to enter the upper echelons of Roman society and become Antony's equal. After all, despite the kinship with Caesar, Octavian's family could not boast of an ancient pedigree. His inconsistency drove Mark Antony to madness. After promising one thing, he immediately did the opposite. If Antony went to the east, Octavian immediately called him to the west, but he was not there himself. Everything was decided in the spring of 37, when Octavian and Antony met on a riverbank in southern Italy. Octavia tried to reconcile the rivals. As a result, the Treaty of Tarentum was concluded, according to which Antony was declared the dictator of the East until December of the 33rd year. The situation suited him perfectly. Now that Antony's hands were untied, he wasted no time and left for Syria. Octavia and her daughters accompanied him to the western border of Greece, from where he sent them back. The woman was pregnant for the third time, and Antony was afraid that the long journey could harm her health. Octavia had 6 children, including daughters from his first marriage. Immediately after his arrival in Syria, he sent a messenger to Alexandria. Cleopatra was waiting for her lover in Antioch, the third largest city in the Mediterranean. There, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene met their father for the first time, and he recognized them as his children. It was definitely a joyful meeting. The commander loved children very much and believed that the more he had, the better. Now, he was practically related to the Ptolemaic dynasty. His children were heirs to the Egyptian throne. Octavia was never able to give him a son. It was said that it was because of this that Antony ended up in the arms of Cleopatra. In September, he gave the Egyptians a truly royal gift. He not only recognized his 3-year-old children, but also endowed their mother with large lands. The Roman confirmed her sovereignty over Cyprus, and to Cleopatra's possessions were added the forested Xoali Syria, part of modern Lebanon, distant Cyrene, located in modern Libya, a generous piece of Cilicia with its cedar forests, part of Crete, and almost all the cities on the rich Phoenician coast. To give his beloved such a generous gift, Antony had to overthrow the previous rulers of those places, accusing them of real or imagined sins. By the 37th year, Cleopatra ruled almost all of the eastern Mediterranean. Only a small part of Judea did not belong to her. A new era was announced in Egypt. The 16th year of Cleopatra's reign became the first. Such a calendar existed until the end of her reign. The 32-year-old queen invented a new title for herself. From now on, she was called Queen Cleopatra, Father-Loving Goddess. Antony's victory over the Parthians would have made her Empress of the East. Some cities were already preparing for this event by issuing coins with double portraits of Cleopatra and the Roman dictator. The queen had every reason to be optimistic about the future. There is a version that Mark Antony and Cleopatra were married that autumn in Antioch, but in fact the Roman was still officially married to Octavia. In the spring of the 36th year, the queen was pregnant again. Antony continued to advance north with his army while Cleopatra went south. She took the long way home, making something of a triumphant drive through her new possessions. Many were glad to see her. The queen's path lay through the hills and rocky mountains of Syria and Lebanon, through steep passes and deep gorges to Jerusalem. At that time, Herod ruled there. The last time they met, he was a fugitive asking for help. Now he sat on the throne. The result of the guests' negotiations with the host was that Herod agreed to lease the Jericho Valley for 200 talents a year, insisting that he would collect taxes from his neighbor, the Nabatean king himself, without the help of Egyptian soldiers and officials. As an excuse for acquiescence, Herod stating that giving Cleopatra a reason to hate him was too risky. The pregnant queen solemnly returned to Alexandria with a load of expensive gifts. Early in the autumn, during the days of the Nile's generous flooding, Cleopatra gave birth to her 4th child. In ancient times, it was believed that the name determined fate. The youngest son of the queen was named Ptolemy Philadelphus, in memory of the glorious 3rd century, when the kingdom of his ancestors was just as strong and large. However, Herod's family made themselves known again. His mother-in-law, Alexandra, did not like her son-in-law very much, and in his place she saw her son, Aristobulus, who was very much loved by the people. Herod could not tolerate conspiracies behind his back and killed his brother-in-law by drowning him in a pool. Alexandra wrote about this to Cleopatra, and she persuaded Antony, who had just returned from Parthia, to deal with Herod. Soon he was ordered to come to Syria. Antony demanded an explanation. Contrary to Cleopatra's expectations, after this meeting, a wonderful relationship was established between the two men, and Herod, having arrived home, threw his mother-in-law into prison. Even after losing contact with Alexandra, Cleopatra remained Herod's problem for a long time. Just in case, the king ordered to increase the defensive strength of Masada and store corn, oil, dates, and fuel outside the fortress's walls. One could not feel safe with such a neighbor as Egypt. At the end of the year 36, a messenger arrived in Alexandria with urgent news. The war was over. Antony and his army returned from the Parthian campaign. Military roads led him to the shores of the Caspian Sea on the territory of modern Iran. The army was stationed in a small village south of today's Beirut, not far from a quiet bay, which would not have been difficult for Cleopatra to reach. Antony asked his girlfriend to join him as soon as possible, grabbing gold, provision, and equipment for soldiers. However, the queen was in no hurry to meet her lover. It was winter, the season of winds and rains throughout the Mediterranean. It took time to gather supplies and equip the ships. Moreover, the queen barely had time to recover from childbirth. Cleopatra arrived at the time of the shortest days and longest nights, shortly after Antony's 48th birthday, and brought him provisions and gold. Antony had reasons for despair other than the procrastination of the Egyptian queen. There were no spectacular Parthian successes, just a series of defeats followed by a disastrous retreat, almost an escape. The Romans made terrible strategic mistakes from the start, retreating exhausted people more than fighting. After a long journey through the desert, the thirsty soldiers were ready to drink salt water. Starving, they ate poisonous berries. Many developed fever and vomiting, followed by dysentery, convulsions, and hallucinations. What rotten water and edible fruit did not do, the heat and then the snows of Cappadocia completed. Almost everyone got frostbite. Before reaching the Syrian shore, Antony had lost nearly a third of his brilliant infantry and half his cavalry, and lost most of 18 minor battles. The nightmarish retreat claimed 24,000 lives. Parthian's story was not only sad, but also instructive. Antony was tricked by a cunning enemy and betrayed by his friends. He realized that he loved the wrong woman and valued the wrong people. Wanting to be famous as a human commander, he encouraged wounded soldiers more than those capable of holding weapons. In addition, the Roman did not know how to take revenge at all. The American king Octavian persuaded Antony to invade neighboring Media, modern Azerbaijan, and betrayed him. The soldier demanded that their commander make amends with Artavasdes, but Antony, quote, did not reproach the king with a single word and did not break the alliance with him. He was so crushed by the defeat that his brain became foggy, and Antony convinced himself that he had actually won. An exhausted, half-mad man was waiting for Cleopatra on the Syrian shore. Whatever they said there, the appearance of the queen brought great relief to both him and his hungry, ragged soldiers. The Egyptian woman remained generous and merciful. She even managed to somehow heal Antony's mind. The state of the army shocked Cleopatra. The Syrian camp has turned into a place of mutual criticism and bitter disputes. The Egyptian woman spent about a month with Antony in a makeshift tent city while he pondered how to proceed. At this time, news reached the camp that the Indian king had quarreled with the Parthian king and was ready to support the Romans. Antony cheered up again and immediately began to prepare a new campaign. At that time, Octavia rushed to help Antony, having previously sent word to her husband about her quick arrival. Cleopatra worried that Octavia's status, her brother's influence, charming disposition, and touching devotion to her husband would interfere with her relationship with Antony. So she resorted to tricks, stopping to eat. Looking at the pale, emaciated Egyptian woman, Antony refused to help his wife and ordered her to return home. Octavia returned to Rome. However, she stubbornly did not want to feel offended and refused to live in her parents' house despite her brother's persuasion. Since that time, Cleopatra and Antony had been inseparable. Cleopatra's feminine charms were enough to keep Antony from the Second Parthian campaign for a while, which he decided to postpone in order to be with his beloved one. Cleopatra was indifferent to military glory, and the Parthian campaign seemed to her a waste of energy, and yet the Egyptian woman did not persuade her friend to abandon her plans. According to common sense, instead of going to Asia, Antony should have visited Rome, where he was absent for 5 years. But Cleopatra used all her eloquence and acting talent to prevent such a development. No matter how much money the war with the Parthians took, the return of the queen's beloved to Rome, to Octavian and Octavia, would have cost much more. Antony sent an ambassador to the east to invite the king Artavasdes to betroth his daughter to the 6-year-old son of Antony and Cleopatra, Alexander Helios. Gifts and flattery did not make any impression on the proud king, and the proposal of engagement was rejected. This gave Antony a reason to seize Armenia in the same spring and make it a Roman province. Thus, it was Antony's revenge for betrayal. On the eve of the great campaign, Antony left part of his legions to winter in Asia and returned to Alexandria in triumph, taking with him not only Armenian riches but also the king with his wife, children, and governors. Out of respect for the royal dignity, Artavasdes and his relatives were chained in gold chains. However, the captured king did not look dejected. Standing before Cleopatra, he refused to bow his knees and addressed the queen by name, showing with all his appearance that he did not recognize her power over him. It was useless to force him. Despite the threat, none of the members of the royal family bowed to the Egyptian woman. Cleopatra first encountered the defiance of humiliated and shackled slaves, and was shocked. Despite the unpleasant episode, she had something to celebrate. From now on, Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings. Cleopatra's co-ruler, 13-year-old Caesarion received Armenian and Parthian titles and became the King of Kings. This is how Antony paid tribute to the memory of Julius Caesar, a rare case of nobility in relation to the former lover of his beloved. However, Cleopatra's sons from Antony were also declared kings of kings. Both boys gained possession of large areas of Asia, so their oriental names were appropriate. Alexander Helios was to rule Armenia, Media, and Parthia when his father conquered them. 2-year-old Ptolemy Philadelphus received Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia, the lands west of the Euphrates. Cleopatra Selene got Cyrene, a huge piece of desert in eastern Libya. Thus, Antony divided the eastern lands, even those that he had not yet conquered. From now on, Cleopatra became an empress and a goddess, and her lover was a great Roman general. Its possessions extended almost throughout Asia, and their borders were dominated by a world guarded by Roman legions. The close relationship between Antony and Cleopatra began to harm the man's reputation in Rome. In November 34th BC, Octavian learned of Antony's triumphal procession in Alexandria and of his lavish gifts to Cleopatra and her children. On January 1st, 33 BC, Octavian entered the post of consul, made public criticism of Antony for the first time. He sent him an official reply, the content of which is unknown to us. However, a fragment of Antony Octavian's private letter was preserved in the works of the historian Suetonius. "What's gotten into you? Is it because I sleep with the queen? But she is not my wife, is she? And was this the first time? This has been going on for 9 years. And what about you? Are you faithful to Livia?" Cleopatra met her 35th birthday happily. The next year promised to be one of the most successful under her rule. The queen and her family finally managed to solve the problem of Rome, the co-ruler problem, and the expansion of territories. Antony decided to spend another winter in Alexandria, the capital of the new empire. Meanwhile, Egypt no longer needed the protection of foreign soldiers. No one in Alexandria reproached the ruler for her too close friendship with Rome. On the contrary, for her generosity, the people loved their queen even more. She continued to launch new ships, and Antony's fleet was soon to double in size. There was a lot of money in the royal treasury. Throughout Asia, from Damascus and Beirut in the east to Tripoli in the west, coins with the image of Cleopatra were minted. At the same time, the queen completed the Caesareum on the seashore, a palace complex that adopted the features of the Roman Forum. Basically, Alexandria was famous for its splendor and wealth. There was a constant trade in luxury items, most of which went to the royal palace. Cleopatra's enemies in Rome readily shared rumors about the luxury that surrounded her. Even Plutarch's grandfather heard many similar stories from his friend Philotas, who at that time was studying at the famous Alexandria Medical School, and at the same time was the personal physician of Antony's eldest son. So one day Philotas got into the palace kitchen where at that time a luxurious royal dinner was being prepared. The guest was amazed by the amount of food, witnessing 8 wild boars being roasted in the kitchen. It turned out that there would be only 12 guests for dinner, but everything he saw before him had to be prepared and served on the table in the best possible way, because even a slight delay could spoil everything. The cooks always prepared several dishes at once because they did not know exactly when they would be called. Cleopatra's court at that time looked extravagant both by Greek and Roman standards. There were rumors of orgies and pleasure palaces near Alexandria that Antony frequented. During one of the balls given by Cleopatra, the noble Roman Plancus, Antony's friend, who was said to have entertained the guests by taking part in an amateur performance in which he, portraying the sea lord Glaucus, danced naked wearing a fishtail and having painted his body blue, and also crawled on his knees. Cleopatra's enemies claimed that she was a promiscuous woman. Such statements were repeatedly heard by historians and poets close to Octavian Augustus. Following them, Dante also considered her a prostitute and placed her in the second circle of his hell, along with other similar sinners. Such interpretations came mainly from the Romans, who considered lust as a feature of the Greek character and considered such accusations quite acceptable for a Greek woman whose lovers were successively 2 of the most prominent Romans. However, apart from vague indications that Caesarion was fathered by someone unknown, there's no evidence that Cleopatra had any lovers other than Caesar and Antony, and the queen's stated reputation was based entirely on her relationship with those 2 men. As for Antony, he certainly loved sensual pleasures, and the general atmosphere surrounding the court of Cleopatra and Antony could be called frivolous. Cleopatra treated the upbringing of her own children very responsibly, and therefore entrusted them to Nicholas of Damascus, a talented orator and a faithful follower of Aristotle in philosophical and life attitudes. Under his supervision, children studied history, philosophy, and rhetoric. The queen still received petitioners, settled lawsuits, participated in religious ceremonies, discussed financial issues with advisors, and appeared at city holidays. Egyptian state relations became increasingly Egyptian-Roman. The legionnaires stayed for a long time in Alexandria. Cleopatra's Roman guards wrote her name on their shields, and the Alexandrian Romans knew no need for anything. Antony and Cleopatra spent a lot of time together. With the introduction of his beloved, the Roman began to often attend classes at the gymnasium, having become the informal head of the Greek community. He willingly dealt with its finances in schools, attended debates and athletic competitions. Together with Cleopatra, they posed for artists and sculptors. He as Osiris or Dionysus, she as Isis or Aphrodite. In the summer of the 33rd year, Antony visited Armenia and made peace with the Median king. The new allies swore to each other an eternal friendship, agreeing to act together against Parthia and, if necessary, against Octavian. War with Parthia was still a very risky venture. However, it was a great opportunity for Antony to prove himself as a worthy successor to Caesar. Military glory was of the greatest importance in Rome, and a victory in the war with Parthia would have allowed Antony to achieve a glory that Octavian could not have achieved in the West. Cleopatra also regarded Parthia as a dangerous enemy and was interested in the Parthian region. To her other languages, she added Parthian and Median, as well as one of the Iranian languages. Octavian and Antony accumulated mutual irritation for a long time. When there were not enough arguments, slander was used. In early January, the new consul came out in support of Antony. Having learned about this, Octavian appeared in the Senate with guards and associates hiding daggers under their cloaks. Octavian promised to show indisputable proof that Antony was a threat to Rome. His opponents noticed the daggers and fled without waiting for the massacre. Almost 400 senators went to Ephesus, where Antony and Cleopatra were at that time, and told them about the true state of affairs in Rome. A serious danger loomed over them, and the presence of the queen significantly complicated everything. Antony's associates persuaded him to send the Egyptian woman away. He agreed, but not for long. Cleopatra was able to insist and stay. In April of the 32nd year, Antony and Cleopatra landed on the island of Samos, off the coast of modern Greece. Samos, which was called the key to the gates of Greece, was an ideal place to fight for the future of the Roman world. Antony's veterans came from Armenia together with Asian recruits. 19 legions were recruited. In May, Cleopatra and Antony made a short visit to the west in the hills of Athens. Cleopatra was supposed to spend the summer in a city where her lover was happy with her rival. The Greeks revered Antony's wife as a goddess and even held ceremonies in her honor. The Egyptian woman decided to act. Promising the inhabitants of the city expensive gifts, she began to convince them to get rid of the sculptures of her rival. The prudent Athenians agreed. Instead, they erected statues of Antony and Cleopatra on the Acropolis. In the summer of 32, Antony gave Cleopatra a priceless gift, the Pergamon Library. 200,000 scrolls were kept in 4 halls of a large building on top of a picturesque hill under the supervision of busts of Homer and Herodotus. People called it a wedding gift or compensation for those who died during the Alexandrian War. Despite the military preparations, the anxious mood in Rome, and the premonition of an imminent disaster, Octavian and Antony had no reason for a conflict for a long time, but it appeared in 32 BC. Cleopatra's love forced Antony to divorce Octavia and ordered her to leave his house. Cleopatra triumphed. She managed to make her rival disappear from Antony's life forever. Octavia took her and Antony's common children and Fulvia's youngest son with her. She was only worried that she would be talked about as the culprit of the new bloodshed. Furthermore, Octavian threatened the Romans with the coming campaign of Rome's eastern enemies led by Cleopatra and Antony's revenge. Octavian made a real monster out of the queen. It looked like hysteria, but such exaggerations reflected the growing hatred of Cleopatra among the Romans. To confirm these accusations, they mentioned that Cleopatra named her son Caesar and claimed that he was the son of a great Roman. This became one of the main accusations brought against Antony by Octavian and his supporters. Furthermore, Octavian made Antony's will public. Fake or real, he noted that in the event of Antony's death, he ordered his body to be burned in the Forum and the ashes to be sent to Cleopatra in Egypt, and also bequeathed her and her children an inheritance. An inheritance clause for the children of Antony and Cleopatra could not be drawn up by any of the Roman lawyers, as foreigners were not entitled to inheritance. Therefore, it might have been invented by Octavian himself to discredit his opponent. Perhaps a more negative reaction was caused by the clause about the burial of Antony in Egypt due to long-standing rumors that he was going to move the capital of the state to Egypt. Most likely, Antony did not keep such important documents in Rome, fearing that their contents would become public knowledge. But how then did the will get into Octavian's hands? There's an assumption that Antony still left a will in the Temple of Vesta, because Octavian could hardly refer to a fictional document, but the content of this will was obviously not exactly as Octavian presented it. This document was read to the senators and added fuel to the fire. So Octavian declared war at the end of October, but not to Antony, as you might think, but to Cleopatra. At that time, the process of declaring war took place in 3 stages. First, the Senate formulated claims to the opposite side and waited a month. If the enemy did not comply with the demands placed on him, the senators met again to decide on the start of hostilities. After 3 days, a messenger was sent to enemy territory. Octavian omitted formalities and threw a spear stained with pig's blood towards the east, which became a symbolic declaration of war. It could not be official because there was absolutely no reason for it. No one tried to explain exactly what criminal acts Cleopatra was accused of. Octavian expected that Antony would remain loyal to the queen, and then it would be possible to declare war with a clear conscience that he was going to oppose his countrymen on the side of the Egyptian woman. At the end of the 32nd year, the Senate officially deprived Antony of power. In the fall, he and Cleopatra moved to Patras, an unremarkable town on the shores of the Gulf of Corinth. From there, they began to build defensive lines along the entire western coast of Greece, from Actium in the north to Methone in the south. The main task was the protection of Alexandria and all of Egypt, against which Octavian eventually declared war. Cleopatra ordered to mint coins with her image as Isis. Antony shipped gold to Rome and bribed everyone. He had superior military strength, but it was not superfluous to sow confusion in Octavian's camp. Cleopatra provided the main part of the funds. Meanwhile, military taxes introduced by Octavian caused riots in Rome. Defectors ran between the two sides. Antony was joined by the monarchs who received power from his hands in the 36th year. The kings of Libya, Thrace, Pontus, and Cappadocia brought their armies and warships. Nothing happened all winter. On the part of Antony and Cleopatra, a fleet of 500 ships was prepared for war, of which 200 were Egyptian. However, they were in no hurry to attack, instead feasting and celebrating in all the passing Greek cities. Of course, Octavian wasted no time organizing his army and fleet. For the second time at a decisive moment, Antony delayed starting the war. Cleopatra wasn't happy about it. Every month of downtime meant huge expenses for her. In a year, 40 to 50 talents were spent on the maintenance of 1 legion. So by the summer, the expenses for 1 infantry alone should have been at least 210. One got the impression that Antony was not very eager for war. At the beginning of the year 31, the outstanding Roman admiral Agrippa made a sudden dash to the Greek shore. He cut Antony off from supplies and destroyed his southern base. Then Octavian sent 80,000 soldiers across the Ionian Sea to the shores of the Adriatic. They pushed the enemy to the north. The infantry did not have time to approach, and Mark Antony had to retreat. Octavian longed for a decisive battle for which Antony was ready. With a titanic effort, he forced the enemy to flee. Weeks of positional warfare and isolated skirmishes have come. Octavian's people ruled the coast of western Greece. Mark Antony's troops were stationed in the south near the Umbrian Gulf. Octavian tried in vain to lure Antony into the sea, and Antony wanted to force the enemy to fight on land. In the spring and summer, the Roman dictator limited himself to cleverly intercepting enemy convoys. Cleopatra was able to help her lover not only with gold. Unlike him, she spoke freely with Asian military leaders in their languages. An Egyptian woman could not get along with Armenian horsemen, Ethiopian infantrymen, Median militiamen, not to mention their rulers. Unity reigned in the eastern armies. However, the wait dragged on. Detrimental to the army in the field, with onset of heat, life in the camp became more and more difficult. The queen could not help but notice that she was not welcome in the camp. The heat was unbearable. Clouds of mosquitoes swirled around the tents, and even the 20-masted flagship Antonia did not cheer up the soldiers. Supplies had to be saved. People became more and more evil from hunger, and Cleopatra's chests were bursting with treasures. Roman soldiers were used to their commanders eating with them from the same cauldron and sleeping on the ground. Such a demonstration of equality was far from the Egyptians. Antony heard the same thing from everywhere. The queen must be removed, but he did not listen to this advice. The Roman part of the camp had reasons to resent Cleopatra, but the louder they expressed their resentment, the more arrogant the Egyptian became. She even quarreled with Julius, who had been recruiting all summer. The fight had happened over dinner when Julius didn't like the wine. "It is sour," the Roman declared, but Octavian always served the best varieties. Julius soon fled, fearing that Cleopatra wanted to kill him. He allegedly learned about this from one of the royal doctors. The threat to life was quite a valid reason to change sides for the third time. Julius sailed to Octavian, using against Antony what Caesar called his most formidable weapon, the surprise attack. He took the battle plans with him. Antony's closest associates hated the queen, and violent disputes broke out more and more often in this tent. The years lived, and the tests passed did not make the queen more flexible than she was in her youth. Cleopatra was too used to absolute power. Months of inactivity changed the balance of forces. Antony and Cleopatra, who had originally intended to lure Octavian into the Ambracian Gulf, were locked in a clear blue bay without the slightest room for maneuver. Antony lost time and lost the advantage. Last August, he had to pay tribute to the surrounding cities to feed the soldiers. Slaves and Eastern kings began to run from the camp at the first opportunity. 2 fugitives, a senator and a Syrian king, were captured, tortured, and executed in front of everyone. At the end of August, Mark Antony convened a military council. The old military leader, Caridius, offered to go north and fight on land. He perfectly understood that such a decision meant giving the Egyptian fleet to the enemy. For Cleopatra to sacrifice the fleet was to put Egypt under attack. The queen began to argue desperately, arguing the merits of a naval battle. Her arguments were convincing in their own way. Antony did not have enough soldiers for a land war. Without ships, they would not have been able to reach Italy, and the passage of the army through the mountains could be too expensive. Antony chose the sea because Octavian had a powerful united Roman army and he had the advantage on land. At sea, both sides could equalize their forces. The commanders did not want to start the war with a defeat. Following the old Roman custom, Antony beached 80 ships that lacked crew and burned them to prevent them from falling to the enemy. However, the fire was soon extinguished by a sudden storm, and the storm raged over the coast for 4 days. When it became clear, only charred wreckage lay near the water. On the night of September 1st, Cleopatra's people secretly transferred her chests to the Antonia, and the jewels were loaded onto special transport ships. At dawn, 3 squadrons went out to sea from the narrow harbor. Cleopatra did not take part in the battle and guarded the remaining 60 ships. Octavian's fleet of 406 ships stood a mile from the bay, as did the enemy's 240. At noon, a fierce battle began. Suddenly, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Cleopatra's ships raised their sails and, deftly using the wind, wedged themselves into the thick of the battle. Octavian's soldiers, dumbfounded with astonishment, watched as the Egyptian flagship rushed towards them. The enemy's consternation still became greater when Antony's ships put to their oars and followed him. Antony and Cleopatra managed to save a third of their ships, and with Egyptian gold. Of course, this maneuver was thought out in advance. Otherwise, Cleopatra would not hide chests and set sails on her ships. They were not going to fight, but simply make a diversionary maneuver to save themselves and the treasures. At the same time, they left their own soldiers to fight. The queen chose the moment with genius precision and skillfully used the tailwind. Octavian knew about the maneuver plan, so he was ready for it. Antony and Cleopatra were not going to fight to the end. Their plans included breaking through the blockade and opening the way to Egypt. On the 2nd of September, several of Octavian's ships set out in pursuit of the fugitives. Cleopatra was waiting for her lover in the open sea. He boarded the Antonia with 2 close friends. Antony did not want to admit defeat because the battle, more like separate skirmishes, continued for several more days, and it ended in nothing. Not even Octavian could tell who was victorious in the end. 3 days later, Cleopatra docked at Cape Tynerit on the southern tip of the Peloponnesian Peninsula to replenish food and provisions. After a while, the fugitives were overtaken by the remaining ships with news of the end of the Battle of Actium. The decisive battle took 4 hours. Antony's fleet resisted for a long time, but was eventually destroyed. However, the army stood firm on land. Touched, Antony bestowed the soldiers with generous gifts from the palace of his beloved. The couple continued their journey through the Mediterranean Sea to Egypt. Having landed on the desert coast in the northwest of the country, they went in different directions. Antony hastened to the 4 legions that remained in Libya, hoping to regroup. Cleopatra was returning to Alexandria, having lost her lover, the fleet, and a considerable part of the wealth. The queen understood the risks of returning to her native city after the disaster, and therefore going ashore, she informed the people gathered on the pier about the unprecedented triumph. Almost on the same day, Antony's 19 legions and 20,000 horsemen went over to Octavian's side. Before returning, Cleopatra ordered the arrest and killing of all her opponents, confiscating their houses and money. She looked for additional funds wherever and however she could, not shying away from removing treasures from temples. Money had to be needed in any case, if only to postpone the inevitable. Cleopatra equipped a new army and began to create new alliances. Artavasdes, the rebellious king of Armenia, who had spent the last 3 years in prison in Alexandria, was executed, and his severed head was sent to Media. The queen counted on the help of the Median king, Artavasdes' old enemy, but he was in no hurry to swear allegiance to her. As before, Cleopatra turned for help to the east, where she had trade connections and long-standing supporters, and Octavian had no influence. Cleopatra intended to escape from the country by dragging the ships 40 miles overland from the Mediterranean into the Gulf, then to enter the Red Sea and move with the entourage and the treasury away from Egypt, perhaps even to India, where there is no war and slavery. However, on the other side of the isthmus lived the Nabateans, who lost more than 1 year in senseless quarrels with Herod due to quarrels with Cleopatra. So they burned every Egyptian ship as they were brought ashore. For Cleopatra, this defeat was especially bitter because this was where her road to the throne began. At the same time, Herod went over to Octavian's side, and Cleopatra tried day and night to make military alliances with neighboring nations. So far, she managed to mobilize only a squad of gladiators, well-trained fighters who were preparing for games in honor of the expected victory. They went south from the territory of modern Turkey, but Herod made it impossible for them to go beyond Syria. For the queen, the war on her territory was tantamount to madness. After Herod's betrayal, she had only Egypt left. The people were loyal to her, and the inhabitants of Upper Egypt expressed their readiness to defend their leader. But Cleopatra refused. They had no chance against Octavian's troops. Besides the Egyptians, only 400 loyal Gauls and the remnants of the fleet had to be reckoned with. The real climax of the war took place in Alexandria a few months later. Cleopatra, at this time, desperately tried to save the situation. She amassed a large collection of poisons, which she tested on prisoners and animals to determine which would bring the quickest and easiest death. The queen did not panic. Her courage remained with her. The same could not be said about Antony. He rushed through North Africa in the company of his former mentor and close commander. The Roman expected to concentrate his troops, but soon found that 4 of his legions had gone over to the side of the enemy. Desperate, he tried to end his life, but his friends saved him and took him to Alexandria. Antony returned to the palace without reinforcements and, according to Dion, without much success. It was late fall, the time of sowing. Cleopatra was engaged in strengthening approaches to Egypt. Antony tried not to be seen by anyone. He ordered the construction of a long causeway in the harbor of Alexandria and settled in a hut at its end, at the foot of the lighthouse. Antony stayed as a hermit for a short time and soon returned to the palace. Cleopatra had no difficulty in luring her lover back. At the same time, Antony's army surrendered to Octavian. On his side was Herod, the Roman governor of Syria, and even Nicholas of Damascus. Now, Octavian had even more people than he needed. Having lost hope, Antony forgot his fear, returning to the palace. He, quote, involved the whole city in a series of celebrations, drinking parties, and festivities without any particular reason. Cleopatra organized lavish celebrations in honor of birthdays of her and Antony's sons from previous marriages, 15-year-old Antyllus and 16-year-old Caesarion. Mixing Egyptian and Roman traditions, Antony and Cleopatra celebrated the boy's entry into adulthood. Both were drafted into the army to raise the fighting spirit of the Egyptians. For several days, the city was full of excitement. In autumn, Caesarion was already called Pharaoh. Antony and Cleopatra laughed in Octavian's eyes. After all, they had sons, therefore a future. But he did not. During the autumn, ambassadors shuttled between the adversaries, bringing bribes and offerings to one side and threats and promises to the other. Cleopatra asked for one thing: to leave the kingdom to her children. It was one thing to part with life, and quite another to sacrifice children and the country. Most of all, the queen was afraid that she would not leave heirs. Her children were from 7 to 17 years old. The eldest was already trusted to rule without their mother. Cleopatra sent Octavian a golden scepter, crown, and throne. She was willing to abdicate in exchange for a pardon, counting, as Dion suggested, that though he hates Antony, he may yet look upon her. Antony believed that he would be allowed to settle in Egypt, or at least in Athens. Octavian ignored Antony's request, but answered Cleopatra. Officially, he sent some threats to her address, but in a personal letter he agreed to show her leniency on one condition: to execute Antony, or at least send him into exile. The sad truth was that Antony had nothing to offer. Cleopatra's position was a little more advantageous. At her disposal, as before, were the greatest wealth, still not under the control of Rome. It had long become one of the main reasons for the war. Due to the avalanche of desertions, the isolation of Antony and Cleopatra reached the point where they had no one to correspond with. A little relief came in the winter. Octavian had to return from Samos to Rome, where disturbance was brewing. Disgruntled soldiers had to be occupied with something. Octavian returned to the east only at the beginning of spring. In Syria, Octavian was welcomed by Herod, who immediately sent him gifts and provisions and placed him in his palace. He provided Octavian with everything he needed for the upcoming transition, as Cleopatra had 6 years earlier, only this time with goodwill. The king provided Octavian with a sum equivalent to 4 years' income of an Egyptian woman from Jericho. At the beginning of summer, he arrived at Pelusium. His plan was to attack Egypt simultaneously from two sides, from Syria and from Libya, using the legions that had previously belonged to Antony in the west. Arrangements with Cleopatra allowed Octavian to cross the eastern border of Egypt without encountering any resistance. Realizing that the forces are catastrophically unequal, Cleopatra was silently preparing herself for new concessions and even outright betrayal. First of all, she refused the residents of Upper Egypt to create a militia, probably still counting on the success of the negotiations, and now asked the Alexandrians not to resist the invaders. She fought for her life, her throne, and her children. Cleopatra ruled for 20 years and said goodbye to illusions a long time ago. She understood that if Octavian was in love, it was not with her but with her wealth. She ordered her mausoleum to be filled with precious stones, jewelry, works of art, chests of gold, and other luxury items. All these riches were prepared for burning. If Cleopatra is destined to perish, let the riches of Egypt perish with her. Thoughts about this did not give peace to Octavian. When he was on the approach to Alexandria, Antony, having gathered a small army, marched out to meet the enemy's army a few miles to the east of the Canopic Way. Octavian's army was weakened by the long transition, and Antony's cavalry managed to win, forcing the vanguard to flee. The cheerful general returned to Alexandria to share the good news. Then, rejoicing in his victory, he ran into the palace without removing his battle clothes, kissed Cleopatra, and presented to her one of the warriors who had most distinguished himself in that battle. For bravery, Cleopatra awarded the young man with golden breastplates and a helmet. He gratefully accepted the award and ran to Octavian the same night. The indomitable Antony made another attempt to lure the enemy troops to his side. After all, some of these soldiers had once been under his command. He challenged Octavian to a duel, but he only dryly replied that Antony had many other ways to die. Before we continue talking about the last days of Cleopatra, we would like to ask you to like this video. And if you like studying history with us and learning about the biographies of legendary personalities of our time, subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos. On the evening of July 31st, a gloomy, silent dinner was held in the palace. Antony said goodbye to his friends because he knew that he might not be around tomorrow. The commander did not ask them for senseless resistance. He only wanted a dignified death for himself. At sunrise on the 1st of August, Antony with the remnants of the infantry marched out of the city gate, positioning himself so that he could see the movement on the sea. His fleet came close to Octavian's ships and saluted the enemy with raised oars. Octavian's fleet returned the salute, after which, as Antony could see from the shore, the ships returned to the harbor together without engaging in battle. Before the two fleets had time to merge into one, Antonia left the cavalry. Cleopatra did not wait for the return of her lover and hurried to the mausoleum with her faithful servants. They closed the massive door behind them and lowered the bars. The entrance was securely blocked, but the queen ordered the bolts to be bolted just in case. The dramatic escape to the mausoleum was designed to push Antony to commit suicide. The news reached him that his beloved is no longer there. Without Cleopatra, Antony lost the meaning of life. According to Plutarch, he immediately removed his breastplate and shouted, "O Cleopatra, it is not that I have lost you that scares me, because soon we will be reunited. But I am bitter that such a great man as I yielded to a woman in bravery." According to an earlier agreement, Antony's servant Eros agreed to kill him when needed. Antony asked him to fulfill his promise. Eros took out his sword and, turning away from his master, killed himself. Then Antony, drawing his sword, tried to do what the servant did not dare to do. The weapon penetrated the abdomen without touching the heart. Losing consciousness from heavy bleeding, he fell on the bench. Soon Antony came to his senses and begged his associates to stop his torment, but they, having betrayed him for one more and now the last time, left the room. As soon as Cleopatra learned about it, she ordered Antony's body to be brought to the mausoleum, and then with the help of the ropes used to lift the stone blocks and her two faithful maids, Irada and Hermione, she pulled him inside. Soon the commander died in Cleopatra's arms. One of Antony's bodyguards immediately warned Octavian of his death, and he and his men hurried to Cleopatra. The queen refused to let Proculius into the mausoleum. He had to speak to her through a tightly closed door. In response to Octavian's offers, she demanded firm guarantees for the children who, with the exception of Caesarion, were under reliable protection. Proculius did not give unequivocal answers. He only convinced the queen that she should not worry and she could completely rely on Octavian. Distrustful Cleopatra took precautions. She had long worn a dagger in her belt. Caesarion, accompanied by his mentor Rhodon, was sent up the Nile, spending a considerable amount of money on the way so that he could reach the coast and sail to India. The queen understood that asking for her eldest son was pointless. Proculius was able to achieve little in the course of negotiations, but at least he took the opportunity to study the mausoleum from all sides, and seeing an open window, climbed inside with two servants. Seeing the Romans, Cleopatra drew a dagger to kill herself, but Proculius preceded her. Rushing forward, he firmly embraced the queen with both hands, wrenched out the dagger, and searched her clothes for poison, continuing to say with all politeness what he was commanded. Octavian assigned Cleopatra a bodyguard, giving clear instructions to relentlessly ensure that the Queen of Egypt did not take her own life. Otherwise, treat her kindly and fulfill all her wishes. Cleopatra had already tried to take her own life twice, and everything that could be used for this was hidden from her. Most likely, all the treasures were taken out of the mausoleum at the same time. The dictator's men did not touch anyone close to Cleopatra so that she would not despair and harm herself. Her children were treated well. But Antony's 16-year-old son, Antyllus, was betrayed by his own mentor. Antyllus hid in a sanctuary located, apparently, behind the walls of Caesarea. He begged for mercy, but Octavian's men dragged him outside and beheaded him. Cleopatra was allowed to bury Antony herself. On the 3rd of August, a true royal funeral took place. But from excessive manifestations of grief, the queen experienced infection and fever. However, she was happy about the disease. Having given up food, Cleopatra could now die quietly without the Romans' involvement. Octavian quickly suspected something was wrong and began to threaten her with massacre of children, so the queen had no choice but to agree to eat and be cured. At that time, Octavian had already managed to show himself from the best side. He decided to forgive Alexandria and its inhabitants. As Dion believed, Octavian did not want to cause irreparable damage to such a large number of people who, for various reasons, could be very useful to Rome. Events developed rapidly. Cleopatra demanded an urgent meeting with Octavian and met with him on August 8th. The guest was of few words, tried to stick to pre-prepared language, avoided talking about the fate of Egypt and the princes. Seeing that the pleas did not work, Cleopatra revealed her trump card. Acknowledging Octavian's victory, she gave him a description of her treasures. The dictator began to study the list, and then the palace runner Seleucus asked to speak. He stated that the queen stole and hid several very valuable items. Hearing this, Cleopatra jumped from her bed, clung to his hair, and hit him in the face. Octavian, unable to contain his smiles, tried to stop her and heard a sharp answer in Cleopatra's spirit. "But this is simply unacceptable, Caesar. You honored me in my wretched situation with visits and conversation, and one of my slaves accuses me of having put away hidden trinkets. Yes, I hid it, but not for myself, but as a gift to Livia and Octavia, so that they would try to soften your heart." On August 9th, Cleopatra learned that Octavian planned to leave for Rome in 3 days, taking the queen and princes with him. She immediately sent a messenger to Octavian asking for permission to make sacrifices in Antony's honor. The dictator allowed it. The next morning, the queen was taken to his grave. Returning to her mausoleum, the queen ordered a bath and breakfast to be prepared for her. Towards evening, a peasant appeared at her door with a basket of ripe figs. The guards examined the contents of the basket, and the peasant shared the fruit with them, after which he was allowed inside without hindrance. After some time, Cleopatra sealed the previously prepared letter and asked to deliver it to Octavian as soon as possible. And she herself let go of all of her servants, except Irada and Hermione. The women opened the doors of the mausoleum, dressed Cleopatra in luxurious clothes, gave her signs of royal honor, and put a diadem on her head. Opening the letter, Octavian grimaced. Again, complaints and a request to bury her next to Antony. After reading the message, he suddenly realized what had happened and was horrified. At first, the dictator wanted to run to the mausoleum, but then he changed his mind and sent trusted people. They rushed to the mausoleum, which was guarded by unsuspecting guards. Together, they broke inside, but it was too late. According to Plutarch, everything happened very quickly. Cleopatra lay on a golden Egyptian bed with lion paws instead of feet and lion heads on the edges. Dressed in the best of her robes, she held the signs of pharaonic dignity in her hands, a hook and a whip. The deceased looked quite happy. Irada was dying at her feet. Hermione, who was weakening before her eyes, awkwardly tried to adjust the tiara on Cleopatra's hair. One of Octavian's men shouted furiously, "Great Hermione!" Before falling breathless next to her queen, she only had enough strength to give an answer that Cleopatra would be proud of. Yes, it is truly beautiful and worthy of the successor of so many kings. Octavian was convinced that the queen resorted to the help of the snake. Arriving on the scene shortly after his loved ones, he tried to bring Cleopatra back to life. They sent for the Psylli, the Libyan snake charmers who were believed to be immune to all kinds of poisons and could, by sucking the poison from a wound and reciting a spell, bring the dead back to life. As expected, the miracle did not happen, and Cleopatra was not resurrected. Most likely the queen took one of her poisons. However, no one knows the truth. 9 days passed between Antony's death and the death of Cleopatra. All that can be said with absolute certainty is that Cleopatra held on heroically until the end. She turned out to be one of those who gained eternal life due to the circumstances of her death, an unbroken woman who chose her own destiny. Cleopatra was buried with royal splendor. To do otherwise was to annoy the Alexandrians. According to Plutarch, she was indeed buried next to Antony. Irada and Hermione were also honored with a proper burial. Most likely, they were mummified. On the grave of 3 women, a majestic monument worthy of the tombs of the Ptolemies was erected. According to one description, the statues of Irada and Hermione guarded the entrance to the tomb. Plutarch claimed that Cleopatra had been buried in the very center of Alexandria alongside the previous Ptolemies. According to the latter hypothesis, Antony and Cleopatra were buried 20 miles west of Alexandria on the sun-scorched hills of Tepesiris Magna, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Octavian ordered the completion of the mausoleum. Its construction was completed already in a captured city, unsure of its future. The Alexandrians now became subjects of Rome. Neither the tomb nor the mausoleum was ever found. Cleopatra lived for 39 years, including 22 years ruling the kingdom. 10 years longer than her great predecessor, Alexander the Great, whose legacy she handed over to Rome against her will. Cleopatra, in vain, entrusted the lives of her children to Alexandrian tutors. Caesarion reached a port on the Red Sea, but Rhodon persuaded him to return to Alexandria and start negotiations with Octavian. He could not leave his cousin alive, and he could not drive the son of the divine Caesar through the streets of Rome during the triumphal procession. So, as soon as the 17-year-old returned to Alexandria, he was captured, tortured, and killed. The younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, did not pose any threat, and Octavian took them to Rome and gave them to be raised by his sister. They grew up in a large and rich family, together with Antony's other children. A year after Cleopatra's death, her surviving children were still forced to participate in the triumphal procession. Later, Octavian gave Cleopatra Selene to Juba II, who at the age of 5 took part in Caesar's African triumph and since then was brought up in Rome, showing a special interest in history. They had similar fates. Both remained orphans and suffered many humiliations. Juba was an educated man and even wrote poetry. Octavian later put his favorite to rule Namibia. It is known that the little brothers of Cleopatra Selene were spared life, but after the triumph, their traces were lost. Cleopatra Selene continued her mother's work, which, judging by the coins, was surprisingly similar. The young couple turned their capital into a center of arts and collected a wonderful library. Many Egyptian sculptures were transported to Mauritania. Cleopatra Selene collected the busts of her ancestors and kept sacred crocodiles. The only known grandson of Cleopatra, Ptolemy of Mauritania, inherited the throne in the 23rd year AD. 17 years later, he visited Rome at the invitation of Emperor Caligula. They were both descendants of Mark Antony, that is, third cousins. The Roman emperor behaved like a friendly host until the African king appeared at the gladiatorial fights in a luxurious purple toga. Caligula was angry and ordered the execution of Ptolemy. This was the end of Cleopatra's glorious dynasty. Octavian officially annexed Egypt on August 31st. The first year of his reign coincided with Cleopatra's last. Later, the emperor instituted a new calendar starting the countdown from the 1st of August, the day he entered Alexandria. Cleopatra's posthumous fate was full of drama no less than her life. A versatile, strong personality remained in the memory of humanity as a predatory temptress. Cleopatra has always caused equal hatred and envy. However, the truth was that the queen was a devoted and loving daughter, a patriot and protector of her people, a brave woman, a tough ruler with strong beliefs, and a brilliant actress. This is how she will remain in the memory of future generations. We hope you enjoyed our video about this truly legendary woman. And if you want to immerse yourself in the life story of another famous personality, click on the video that appeared on your screen. And don't forget to like this video. And we say goodbye to you for a short time. It was Biographer History. See you again on the pages of history.